Guten Morgen und herzlich willkommen. Good morning. My name is David Gill. I'm the German Consul General here in New York, and I would like to welcome you all to one of two events the Consulate, together with the American Consul on Germany, host to reflect the German reunification. The 30th anniversary of this historic landmark is a great opportunity to remember the early 90s of the last century, as well as to consider the state of unity of my home country. When we look back, we realize not only the tremendous speed of the reunification process, but also how multi-layered this process was. While East Germany was rebuilding democracy with all its institutions, it had to manage a transition in so many areas. The judiciary, the educational system, the broken economy, the reformation of the police and the dissolution of the army, just to name a few. A monetary union followed quickly. We also had to find a way to cope with the past, with injustice and persecution, and how to hold the people in the former communist regime responsible for the political oppression of their fellow citizens. This was the work in which I was active in those times, serving as the chairman of the Citizens Committee for the dissolution of the Stasi. But there was also the question of how a united Germany would be received and treated by the international community, especially considering the fact that the post-World War era had not yet ended. It was in this area that our guest today, Robert Zoellick, was of critical importance. I'm very happy that we will focus today on this topic. A truly remarkable piece of world politics and a cornerstone in the German-American relationship. We Germans won't forget how supportive our American friends were in this crucial time for our country. I look forward to hearing about Robert Zoellick's experiences during this time, and also to hear his thoughts about United Germany's role in the world today, as well as the state of the transatlantic relationship. Thank you for being with us this morning, and thank you to Steve for the great partnership between the American Council on Germany and the Consulate General of Germany here in New York, and I will now hand over to Steve. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I can say on behalf of the ACG that we are delighted to partner with you, your colleagues at the German Consulate, and also with 1014. But particularly, we're happy to partner with you to host this event today with Robert Zoellick, just a few days before the 30th anniversary of German unification. Bob Zoellick, who served on the American Council on Germany's board from 1994 to 2000, hardly needs an introduction. His career has set the gold standard for public service. He has served as Deputy Secretary, Undersecretary, and Counselor at the U.S. State Department, as Ambassador and U.S. Trade Representative, as Counselor to the Secretary of the Treasury, as Deputy Chief of Staff at the White House, and also as the President of the World Bank. Bob Zoellick currently serves as Senior Counselor at Brunswick Geopolitical, an advisory service of the Brunswick Group, and also as a Senior Fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. A prolific writer, his most recent book, titled America in the World, A History of U.S. Diplomacy and Foreign Policy, was just published in August. It goes without saying that Bob Zoellick is a keen observer of history and has often enjoyed a front row seat. His government experience spans 6 U.S. presidencies during the Cold War, in its closing chapter, and into the first decades of the 21st century. Important for today's discussion, as mentioned by David Gill, in 1990, under the Secretary of State James Baker, Bob Zoellick was the lead U.S. negotiator in the 2+4 process, which ultimately led to German unification. Today, Bob Zoellick will share some opening remarks with us, and then we'll have a conversation. So if you'd like to ask a question, please use the chat function in Zoom or send me an email. I can be reached at sokol@acgusa.org. And with that, Bob, it's over to you.
Well, thank you, Steve, for such a gracious and generous introduction. And thanks for all that you and your colleagues at ACG do for the U.S.-German relationship, which I continue to think is fundamental for both countries. I also want to thank Consul General Gill. It's a wonderful story of the transformation of East and West in the Federal Republic of Germany, and I'm really delighted that he's supporting these continuing ties through ACG. So, American diplomacy these days is going through a rough patch. So, perhaps we can glean some insights from the experience. Now, let me step back 30 years and give you a real brief overview of how the United States looked at the diplomatic challenges of German unification in 1989 and 90. We operated at two different levels. One, with a sense of history and strategy, but also we tried to have a fingertip feel for events on the ground within Germany. And I use the fingertip feel word advisedly because I always like the German Fingerspitzengefühl. It seems to have a nice sense of the challenge for diplomacy. So from the historical perspective, many people who look back on those events 30 years ago, and this is true for many historians, focus primarily on the Russia question. They look at the role of Gorbachev and what happened with Russia. Frankly, we also were very committed to trying to work with Gorbachev, but our first priority was the German question. So as students of Germany know, from the 1600s to 1871, the German question referred to a series of smaller states that were in the heart of Europe that were manipulated by outside empires. But from 1871 on, the German question shifted to that of how to deal with a powerful state in Central Europe with no secure borders. After 1945, the solution was to have two German states, with West Germany being a democracy integrated with Western Europe and the United States. So while we were committed to the support of a democratic, unified Germany, we believed this needed to occur within NATO and, at that time, integrated EC, today European Union. We thought this would be positive for Europe, and we also thought it would reassure Germany's neighbors east and west. At the same time, however, we wanted to avoid what we called a Versailles victory. And what we meant by that was a diplomatic result that planted the seeds of its own destruction. And that had both German and Soviet elements. In the case of Germany, we were very focused on trying to avoid any discrimination, or at that time we used the word singularization, that future Germans might resent. At the time, people sort of scoffed, thought that was an unlikely event. But as you see with the political trends in all countries, that's always a risk. And so we thought it was very important that Germany join as a full partner in the international system without limitations. There was also a dimension for the Soviet Union, which is that we wanted to try, while achieving our objectives with Germany and NATO, to offer reassurance on security, economic benefits, borders, and political standing. The second level, however, was equally important. And this was the challenge of combining strategy with the facts on the ground. And the dominant facts of 1989 were that the German people, East and West, became a diplomatic force. they created a momentum for diplomacy. And this is part of the story of the Cold War, was the amazing shift of Berlin from the capital of Nazi Germany to being a symbol of freedom. In 48, 49 with the airlift, with 53 with the crackdown, with 61, 62 with the sort of Berlin Wall, all on to 1989. And Steve was kind enough to mention my book. The book is organized around a series of individuals and episodes. And a number of them actually deal directly with the issues of Berlin and Germany, including JFK and the Berlin crises of 1961. Now, the fact was, at the diplomatic level, if we stalled, we could have created a crisis because of the momentum on the ground. On the other hand, we were fortunate to use the momentum on the ground as an impetus to press for decisions that other countries were frankly reluctant to face. So, as most people who study this events are well aware, Britain, initially France, certainly the Soviet Union, were all quite hesitant about the notion of German unification. And so were many of the other Western European partners. So it would have been easy for people to just delay, to stall. There are many complicated issues. So frankly, we worked most closely with the Federal Republic of Germany to try to create a process, and that was the creation of the 2+4 process, to channel and coordinate the various decisions that would have to be taken. So in a way, we had the strategy based on a historical perspective. We had events on the ground. They had to be linked. And the 2+4 process was the link. Now, the 2+4 process was dealing with the final settlement and dealing with closing out the four-power rights. But in some ways, it also had to operate as a coordinating body, because this was a multiple ring circus or events. We had to deal with the conventional forces issues through the CFE negotiation that President Bush had advanced in May of 1989 with a bold US proposal. We had to deal with changes in NATO to make it acceptable for the Soviets to accept a unified Germany and NATO. We wanted to try to transform the CSCE to more of an organization that could support democracy and human rights. And of course, there were the huge transitions within Germany itself. To make this work, the story of 89-90 is also a story about personal relations among the key leaders. This could have never occurred except for the trust that Bush and Baker had with Kohl and Genscher in particular, but also with Shevardnadze and Gorbachev, and then some of us at lower levels. All this occurs extremely rapidly. I mean, if you think about events in the world today, all this occurs within 10 or 11 months. Just cast your mind back in 10 or 11 months and imagine this occurring in that time period. And that sense of timing always hung over us. Recall that by August 1990, so a few months before unification, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. So my boss Baker and President Bush are pulled intensively to dealing with putting together that coalition. Unification, the 2+4 settlement is signed in September. Unification occurs in October. Shevardnadze is gone by December. By August of the next year, there's a coup in the Soviet Union. And so we never knew when events might take an uncertain turn, or frankly, the events on the ground. We were always concerned that whether it was through former Stasi forces, Russian troops in Germany, some event where people would be selling weapons, that you could have a spark go off and we would lose control of the situation. So that gives you a sense of the overall diplomacy, but looking to the future, I think it's important to recognize that even as we were trying to close out the Cold War in Europe peacefully, we had to have our eye on the future as well. And we expected Germany, by reason of its size, its economy, its power, its geography, would be playing a decisive role in Europe's future, as it had in Europe's past. So, having earned a special relationship with Germany during the decades of the Cold War, not only at the official level, but all the soldiers that had served in Germany, the Germans that had come over and studied and visited the United States, and then adding to it what we hoped would be a successful closing chapter, we wanted to try to leave a foundation for future policy, a special relationship between Germany and the United States within NATO and within the European Union, because that had been the strategic formula that had worked since 1947, 49, the sort of the crisis period, and throughout the Cold War. So obviously, from my point of view, the U.S. would be extremely foolish to ignore the consequences of the drift, or even worse, permit a lasting break with Germany. And that's a lesson for the 21st century as well.
Thank you. As David Gill mentioned, we'd like to use German unification as a jumping off point to talk about developments today and into the future. But before we move on, one of our viewers has submitted a question. He'd like to know if there was a German speaker in the core of the U.S. negotiating team. He writes that it's been said that Helmut Kohl sent his 10-point plan to Washington in German, but in the belief that it wouldn't be understood for a while because it needed to be translated.
I think that's a bit of a stretch. I think the U.S. government had the capacity to get the translation pretty quickly. But as for the sort of the core question, I'm trying to sort of run through the key players. Not Baker, not Bush, and probably not Scowcroft. I had some rudimentary German, but certainly not enough to operate effectively. But people like Jim Dobbins, who was a career Foreign Service officer who had been the DCM in Germany, was a core part of the team. Phil Zellico on the NSC staff spoke German. So it was probably a limitation, but fortunately one we managed to overcome.
Thank you. So
actually, I'll give you this is sort of an interesting little twist though, of a different connection of the American-German relationship. In December of 1989, so this was about a month after the wall had fallen, Baker comes to West Berlin. And at this moment, remember, you were having a sort of East German government that was struggling under Modrow to sort of reestablish itself. And we wanted to try to create the incentives for the Modrow regime to hold the elections that were going to be critical in making the future course. There was some internal discussion about this, but Baker decided to go to Potsdam to have a meeting with the East German officials to emphasize the importance of this. But we thought it was very important to accompany it, and particularly with the Consul General here. I hope this may have come to his attention over the years, with those that were the dissidents, the brave community that spoke up against the regime at incredible peril. So we went to the Nikolai Kirche in Potsdam, which was and we met a number of the Lutheran ministers as well as the lay people. I think Stolpe, who later became minister president of Brandenburg, was there. We wanted to hear their perspective. And while there, we tried to get a sense of what the public mood was about the nature of unification. There's always a danger when things work out relatively well to have sort of 20/20 hindsight. And these very courageous Lutheran leaders started to outline what was then described as die dritte Weg, the third way. And so it was kind of a loose notion, and one could admire their courage. It wasn't exactly the direction we wanted to go. We wanted to see if we could achieve the absorption of East Germany into West Germany. But we asked them about what their public wanted. And they were very honest. They said, oh, no. Our parishioners want what they see on West German TV. And I recall this because My family was of German descent, although many generations. I grew up in the Midwest outside Chicago. And I remember being in that Lutheran church and looking at the hymnals, the Lutheran Small Catechism. It just sort of reminded me of sort of growing up in Illinois. And so on one hand, you had sort of a cultural similarity, but with a with a breach of time and space. But it was also a part of the story here. It was very important to understand what people were thinking in the East. And because, again, at the heart of the story is the courage of the people, particularly in the East, to take on a threatening regime and force the issue on the public agenda.
So perhaps related to that, another viewer question, which goes along the lines of whether or not it was a foregone conclusion that Germany would join NATO, and how Germany's ultimate involvement with NATO was settled with the Russians.
So the short answer is definitely not. If you go back and you look at the commentary at the Times, first off, there was a lot of doubts about whether Germany, the Soviets would permit Germany to be unified, particularly since most of the other Western allies weren't so wildly enthusiastic about it. And then the idea that Germany could be unified in NATO seemed like an extreme step. I mean, recall, even someone as wise as Henry Kissinger in '89 is writing pieces in the press where he's basically looking for a condominium between East and West, sort of to avoid what he saw as potential conflict. And there's a very important notion here I touched on about Russia and German question. You'll see that some people refer to the Cold War being over in 1988 because of the sort of relationship they developed with Gorbachev. And this was Thatcher's view, for example, but also some people in the Reagan administration. The Bush-Baker view was the Cold War could not be over until we ended the division of Germany and the division of Europe, and certainly did everything we could to have Soviet forces go home and sort of create a liberation. That actually leads to a different focus. For example, many historians have ignored what I mentioned, this conventional forces proposal in May of '89, which was designed not only to push the short-range nuclear missile issue to the back, but also to get Soviet forces to leave and start to unleash the sort of political momentum. So all these factors were in play. And as for the idea of persuading the Soviet Union to accept Germany and NATO, the fundamental argument builds on the point I made about the German question. We had to convince the Soviets that Germany would be unified. They wouldn't be able to stop it. But if it were unified, did you want it to be a neutral country in the heart of Europe, or would it rather be better to be linked to the Western European structures? And that was not an easy decision, but it's one that some people like Chernaev and others were talking about with Gorbachev. So we were able to advance that in the context of also making changes in the NATO alliance, which were quite significant. And so at the end of the day, this was a question of whether for the Soviet Union, they could suffer what they felt was sort of the loss of the Warsaw Pact and their standing in an old order, and recognize the benefits of a united Germany in a more stable position in a new order. And obviously, this was also of interest to people in Western Europe, but also the Poles and others in the structure. So it was trying to deal with the overall security structure. You didn't ask this directly, but this also raises the question of, was there a promise of the U.S. And NATO not to enlarge? And the direct answer is no. Shevardnadze and Kozyrev, Soviet foreign ministers, are very clear on this. The amusing part that I often refer to is, anybody who actually dealt with the Soviets, or frankly, who deals with the Russians today, knows that they're not very hesitant to put demands forward, and particularly in writing. So the concept that they would say, oh, well, yes, we had discussions about this, but it's good enough. We had a discussion. We don't have to put it into writing, is kind of a wild notion. But the other clincher is that this issue really comes to a head when Gorbachev visits Washington and with President Bush in June of 1990. And Bush used an argument that actually I had discovered, which was Gorbachev was very enamored in the CSC principles as part of building a new European and Soviet structure. And one of those principles is that countries should be free to choose their own alliance. So at this meeting, President Bush says to Gorbachev, look, we believe United Germany should be in NATO, but if you don't accept that, can you accept that it's up to the United Germany to decide under CSC principles? And Gorbachev says yes, and his team, you can just see physically sort of pull back from him. And but that was the basis, which of course would mean that others are free to choose their own alliance position. And again, Wolfgang Ischner mentioned to me when he was part of the enlargement of NATO in the 90s, and this was discussed with the Russians at that time didn't say that there had been any promise not to enlarge. So what had really happened, and this helps people understand what the nature of the negotiations, things were moving at a very fast pace. And people were trying out ideas. And one of the ideas that Baker tried out was the notion of, could you have Germany in NATO, but with a special treatment, or he used actually the word jurisdiction, which he then later pulled back, for East Germany for stability. And there was certainly no discussion about Central and Eastern Europe. And in fact, even in 1990, we started to open up this notion of NATO liaison with Eastern European countries. I know this particularly because students of this era will know the very last night there was a sort of a momentary crisis in Moscow because there was the question of what would be the status of non-German NATO forces in the former GDR, so the 5 Eastern Länder. And the British were reputed to really be sort of pushing more movement on this, but frankly, I was as well, because in the back of my mind, I was thinking, what if Poland wants to become a NATO member? I wasn't presuming, but what if it does? And you want to have the ability of US or British or other non-German forces to move into Poland. So that was eventually settled with a note that said, obviously, this will be decided by the sovereign Germany, the basic principle, taking into account sort of all these issues. There will be, I'm sure, a long debate about policies towards Russia and, enlargement and so on and so forth. But I would, if you, again, from a German perspective, if you look around the neighborhood and look at Poland and Hungary and others, and you see some of the nationalist movements, all I can say is I'm glad they're part of NATO, because if they were left in sort of a lands between, I'm afraid these movements would likely become even more risky.
We've gotten a number of questions about the events in 1989, 1990, and shortly thereafter. But I'd like to try to sort of fast forward to today a little bit and talk a little bit about today. I'd like to stick with Germany for a moment, and I think that one of our viewer questions provides a very nice segue. Bob, you were talking earlier about having 20/20 hindsight in some senses, and just not knowing things then that you know now. And one of our viewers writes that the German unification process, when thinking about the 2 in the 2+4, was largely driven by West Germany and not as much by East Germany. And obviously, with Helmut Kohl's 10-point plan, with his promises, with the currency union, with the Treuhandanstalt and the privatization of much of Eastern Germany, a lot was driven by the West. And since we're just days away from the 30th anniversary of German Unity Day, there is a lot of conversation about how united Germany is today. And our viewer is curious to know whether you think that the lack of input or the limited input from the East at that time set the foundation for some of the schisms that exist in the country today.
Well, ultimately, these are questions for Germans. And recall, you start out with an important point. When we designed the 2+4, we put the 2 in front of the 4. There were others that put the 4 in front of the 2, or some referred to as 6. And that was conscious because we wanted this to be seen as the Germans driving the unification process. Now, there's a critical constitutional and legal issue people should keep in mind here, and that is students of the basic law of the Germany Constitution will know that there was Article 23 was designed to allow the Saarland to rejoin into the at that time, newly created sort of federal republic. And so, but there was also an article, and I forget the number, but David will probably recall it, or you may recall it, that was sort of designed for a future German unification where you would create national conventions and you'd come and create a new country. Well, remember, all this happens quite quickly. That would have been inconceivable to get done in the process. Secondly, it posed a big problem for international obligations. The rest of the world liked the international legal obligations that the Federal Republic of Germany had committed. And if you'd created a new country, you would have been starting on a blank sheet for international obligations. So in some ways, it was not only a West German strategy, it was a strategy for West Germany and its relations with the rest of the world. And third, remember my little story about the Nikolai here. I mean, at heart, what the people of East Germany decided in a free vote, what they wanted was what they saw sort of in West Germany. Now, within that legal framework, there were a lot of questions about sort of, the German word is Eitel, right? Sort of hubris or arrogance and sort of the sweeping up of the process. And I actually remember speaking with Minister President Stolpe after unification, because I was somewhat worried that if you took 40 years of social market economy and plopped it on the East German economy, that actually the weight would be too heavy and it would sort of break down what I hope would be rebuilding of a market economy. So I tried to suggest the novel notion that maybe East Germany the Eastern lender could deregulate a bit and create open opportunities. But of course, that was somewhat foreign to even the West German culture, much less the East German culture at the time. And so I will also tell you, it didn't surprise me if you think of, David would be able to comment on this more. Given the nature of life under the DDR and frankly before that under Nazi regime, the society was pulverized in many respects. And so I mentioned my sort of respect of the heroism of some of the Lutheran ministers, but as they sort of rose to the larger levels, they were having to learn an awful lot quite quickly. Marcus Meckel, who was the socialist SPD foreign minister, has spoken about this in his own sense, about his sort of changed attitudes about the role of NATO and others. And remember, I mean, this is where the practice of foreign policy, has to deal with the reality of life. This gets done in 11 months, so I suppose we could have had 5 years, but then you might not have had a united Germany or united Germany and NATO. Having said that, I think this is a challenge. It's a good question for people within Germany to ask about the nature of the country and its unity. All I could say is from the perspective of the United States, we've got our own problems on that, so I'm not going to lecture them.
So we said at the outset that we wanted to try to draw perhaps some lessons from your experiences in the 2+4 process. And I found it very interesting listening to you speak at the outset about how you all set about managing strategy, but also the facts on the ground and how you developed a process or a structure to navigate that. And so I'd really like to shift gears and talk about China. Even before the COVID pandemic, I've often wondered if there are any lessons that can be drawn from the very complex 2+4 negotiations that could help when thinking about how the United States and Europe can align their policies towards China. And in May, you had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal with the headline, "The US does not need a new Cold War." And in it, you argued that the US approach to China is one of confrontation, but that diplomacy matters. And as you described earlier today, when you were working with Secretary Baker at the end of the last Cold War, you focused on what you wanted to get done and used diplomatic tools to get there. So can you talk a little bit about where you might see opportunities for a diplomatic approach or a diplomatic alignment?
Well, that's a big topic. And let me just say, as my book suggests, the reason I wrote the book is I do think one can draw a lot of insights from history. But I'm actually skeptical of direct analogies because they're often misplaced. I use history more to ask questions, to kind of think about issues from a different perspective. So from a starting, you mentioned the Cold War, people rush to that as an analogy, and it's clearly a misplaced analogy. I mean, number one, who thinks you're going to be able to contain China? I mean, and so if you're going to have a practical policy, that's not going to work. Second, while there's no doubt that Xi Jinping has strengthened the hold of the Communist Party as part of his authoritarian system, I'm not sure he's really trying to spread a communist ideology around the world. He doesn't seem to have great relations with the communist government in Vietnam. So what you have is more of a traditional authoritarian government that is trying to get its way, sometimes through bullying, sometimes through courting with a tributary system. And then the third issue is, where exactly is the Iron Curtain? I mean, I have a chapter about 1947 and 49 and how the Marshall Plan, the Federal Republic of Germany, NATO all come about, and the heart of a divided Berlin. So where exactly is that in our international system? So I wrote actually a letter to the editor after another op-ed where say, this doesn't mean that you don't have challenges with China, but be careful about sort of rushing to Cold War analogies. More particularly, I think, in terms of the role of diplomacy, the starting point is, so what do you want to accomplish? So I actually have another op-ed that's probably going to get run in the Washington Post soon, where I'm trying to look at Trump's foreign policy and says, it's thrown a lot of verbal bombs, we have a lot of sanctions, but so what have we gotten done on any set of issues? And so I would come back to the starting point for the United States today is obviously our own country. Not only in terms of our capacities with research and education, and in my view, openness as a society, that's ultimately what led to the success of the United States and the West with the Soviet Union, which Reagan could foresee in the 80s. Second, it's the role of your alliance and partners, which is a huge part of the German unification story. They will often disagree, but how can you bring them together? And obviously that relates to partners such as Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, I believe, could have a partnership. I don't think it's going to be an ally for reasons of its own history. But I would highlight the European role in this. It's a topic I've discussed with Kissinger. I think in the long run, how Europe decides it wants to act on some of these fundamental issues about the future of free society and security will be very influential in shaping Chinese behavior. And again, I'm not trying to sort of divide the world into two blocks. I think there's still possibilities to shape Chinese behavior. And then on the practical side, in security terms, you have to make a stand for deterrence, as we did in the Cold War. That, by the way, that probably means a shift in some of the military capacity from aircraft carriers to more submersible objects to sort of have anti-access area denial. And then on the economic topics with China, which is different than the Soviet Union, I believe that you can find some mutual common ground, but you have to do the naughty work of diplomacy. So let me give you an example. Intellectual property rights have been a frustration for European and US firms. China has now created intellectual property rights courts that are finding for foreigners about 85 to 90% of the time, but the penalties aren't high enough. So rather than negotiate a managed trade deal, I'd try to negotiate higher penalties. Forced technology transfer is another frustration. Frankly, when I was a trade representative, it was hard to get companies to bring the evidence for those cases. It's probably comes from the requirement for joint ventures, which is the creation for the temptation of the forced technology transfer. So I press the Chinese much more on the on the joint venture requirement. And I can go through each of these from Belt and Road and others to sort of find some areas of common ground. And I'd leave people with these thoughts. The United States has lost 200,000 people now to the pandemic. Biological security is a security topic as serious as any other. And if you talk to serious biologists, they'll point out that there's about 5 viruses a year normally that sort of could become future COVIDs. We're going to need to work with the Chinese and others to try to identify these more quickly and act on them more quickly. If you're interested in issues of climate and the environment, how are you going to do this without China? And frankly, as well as traditional security questions, whether it be proliferation or others. So John Bolton writes a piece saying, gee, China's not helping enough with North Korea. Well, is that a shock given your relationship, or for that matter, Iran? So I want to be clear. This doesn't mean, and this is another lesson from the Cold War, it's a lesson from German unification. It doesn't mean we give up on our values. But take Hong Kong, for example. As opposed to sanctioning a bunch of leaders so we can't talk to them, I would encourage the United States to do what Britain has done, and frankly get others in Europe and Australia to join and say, let people from Hong Kong come to the United States if they feel that they don't want to live in an authoritarian system. What better way, I mean, to be able to signal the difference between the two societies? So the bottom line of this, Steve, comes to the idea that there's a mood in the United States now that simply confronting China and having conflict is the solution. And I would just urge people to say, you know, the lessons of 89, 90, or even the Cold War is, what do you want to accomplish? And let's be smart as opposed to just express our frustrations.
So let me pick up with that last thought on the mood in the United States and sort of the path forward, because with a important election about a month away, I know everybody is very curious about the election, but also about what happens after the election. And just last month, you had a piece in Foreign Affairs with recommendations for a Biden administration if Joe Biden wins the election. And in that article, you argued that the new administration would face a staggering to-do list, both at home and abroad, but that it should leverage its domestic agenda in crafting its foreign policy priorities. So can you talk a little bit about that interplay between the domestic priorities and how they might manifest themselves in U.S. foreign policy priorities moving forward?
So Steve, to start, the example was we looked about German unification. I was trying to make a point that in my diplomatic method, you have to focus on the details of the problem, but you also have to try to connect dots. And so my little account was trying to connect strategy and history with the sort of events on the ground and an effective process. Well, similarly, many of the people supporting former Vice President Biden have a long list of frustrations with the Trump administration's foreign policy, as do I. But I think their challenge is going to be, as you alluded to, if Biden's elected, just consider his agenda. He's got an ongoing pandemic and a frayed healthcare system. He's got the need for inclusive economic growth. He's got challenges of immigration. He's got racism. He's got climate and sort of environmental topics. That's a huge list. Now, for people who are students of the American political system, it's not so easy to get a lot of things done right away. So my former boss, Baker, when he was chief of staff to Reagan in '81, said, Mr. President, you have 3 priorities: economic recovery, and economic recovery. Now, I think one of the challenges for a President Biden is the opportunity is he probably has more experience in getting things done with Congress than anybody since Lyndon Johnson. And that's a wonderful attribute if the opposition will sort of work with him. And so, but his time is going to be focused on a lot of those issues. Now, the point of this is not to say that he can ignore the international agenda. It's how do you leverage the domestic agenda internationally? So, for example, if you do something with Dreamers or on immigration, some of which you can do with executive order, why not connect it to a strengthening relationships with Mexico as opposed to focusing on a border wall? If we do something, if we get some vaccines early next year, as I talked about in this article in the Wall Street Journal today, you should be working globally, because you're not going to really deal with this pandemic until you're able to help deal with some of the other countries in the world. And in particular, look at the model that President Bush 43 used with HIV, AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis. Probably did more for American relations with Africa than anything in our history. The United States has the capacity to do that. If on climate change, you move towards various carbon limitations in the United States, don't just rejoin the Paris Accord. come up with ways where you can make this more inclusive, such as soil carbon in Africa, which could absorb a lot of carbon, but also help African agriculture, or avoided deforestation and forestation, which is important in many developing countries. So it's how to link those topics with with sort of your international agenda. And then to take it the next step, that is actually a pretty good agenda to restart relations with allies. If you think about climate change, sort of pandemic, inclusive sort of economic growth, we have to add to this sort of data security and sort of cyber issues. It's not to ignore traditional security problems such as Russia or, frankly, regional hegemons and weapons of mass destruction, but let's rebuild from a common base. And then, frankly, do the same with the United States allies in the Asia Pacific. And then from that base, we turn to the two biggest questions: the future of free societies and the role of China, which we talked about. So what I tried to do in that piece is get a sense of how you could connect a very busy domestic agenda in a coherent way with your alliance and your international agenda. But so what I'd say for people sort of as part of this event, you know, it'll be very interesting to watch who some of the key people will be if Biden's elected. Because what I've tried to outline there is something that really requires a little integration and synthesis as opposed to just a case-by-case approach.
So since you mentioned today's piece, let me draw you out on that a little bit. In the piece, you talk about the fact that many developing countries navigated the global financial crisis of a decade ago because emerging markets served as opportunities for economic growth. But today, in this pandemic, they're finding that their healthcare systems are being taxed and tourism has come to a halt, and basically these emerging markets have been crushed. Obviously, the G20 can play a little bit of a role in trying to craft a global COVID recovery program. But with the World Bank and IMF meetings just a couple of weeks away, do you think there's a special role for Europe and the United States, or is it more through international and multilateral organizations like the World Bank and the IMF and even the G20 that we have some hope of a global recovery?
Well, the World Bank and IMF can only work effectively if their major shareholders are supportive. And a lot of those shareholders are the US and Europe. And frankly, this could create some common ground with China because there's shared interests here with China and other players. So as you said, in some ways, what prompted me to write this was I was at the World Bank in the global financial crisis. So I sort of pop up Zoellick-like at various points in world history here. I was just struck the role the G20 played in that crisis, which it wasn't perfect, but first under President Bush and President Obama, Gordon Brown did a wonderful job organizing the London Economic Conference in 2009. There was much more of a sense of the need for the international economy to come together. Now, as a practical matter, a lot of monetary authority and fiscal support has been done, but we haven't really gone at sort of the core problem I was talking about biological security, and particularly the developing countries are in a much more worse position. What I was trying to highlight here was that because of the central bank policies, some of the money has flowed back into developing markets, but it's sort of on the edge. It's a risky situation. And I highlighted a series of events, in part because of countries in conflict on trade or US-China or other things that could happen in corporate debt markets. You could see a real move back. And what I'm really worried about is that in some regions of the world, you could have really a decade of stagnation. And then from our own interest in Europe and the US, what does that do to migration policies? What does that do to sort of other aspects of insecurity? So as in general with the diplomatic approach, there are things that different players can do. I think the IMF and World Bank would want it to be supportive, but ultimately they need the big economies of the world to say, yes, this is something that we want you to engage in, and if necessary, we'll put additional resources in. So at the end of the day, this is part of our bigger problem here, which is that, you know, the United States objects to a lot of these institutions. Then it sees China playing a larger role. Well, what a surprise that should be, that China pursues its interests in them. And we undermine our own position when we pull back from those institutions. Europe, I think, is somewhat stunned by this behavior. And I think if we had an administration that came back and tried to cooperate with Europe, this would all not be sweetness and light, but I think that there would be a hunger and appetite to try to turn some of this around.
As we start to wrap up, I'd like to fold in another viewer question who is asking about the role of citizen diplomacy and programs like the Congress Bundestag Youth Exchange Program, and whether or not they can serve to shore up the German-American relationship in specific, but more broadly, the transatlantic relationship, and how we can try to engage the next generation of Americans in learning German and in caring about Germany.
So, hearkening back to my book, one of the points I point out is that from the start, the United States in 1776 thought about trade as more than a matter of economic efficiency, was trying to break open the world of government-run economies, imperialism, colonialism, mercantilism, to allow room for private sector actors. And today, when probably the same for you, Steve, when people in Europe or Asia or Latin America approach the United States and being befuddled, I said, keep in mind, the White House isn't everything, Congress isn't everything, even the governors and states aren't everything. You have to look at the private sector. The WHO is a wonderful example. Trump foolishly pulls out of the WHO. Who's the second largest funder? The Gates Foundation, right? If I think about the world energy strategy, it's been transformed by some innovators who took some existing technology to come up with fracking and different capital markets. I have some minimal ties with the technology industry, and the attitude about what can become in Silicon Valley is so different than you encounter probably in many places, including in Germany. And so the private sector interactions are very, very important. And part of this, of course, is citizen diplomacy. Remember my story of German unification. What really creates the opportunity are the people of East Germany deciding on their own future and running big risks. So there's lots of ways this can be done. A lot of it, I again shudder when I think about how we made it harder for foreign students to come to the United States. Obviously there's cultural connections, there's journalistic and media and others. What I'm just a little worried about, and I actually, before the pandemic, I went to Heidelberg and spoke to a lecturer there, but also spoke to students, is that sort of all continents seem to be withdrawing a little bit, and there's a bit of an insularity in that process. So you have this irony that through social media and other networks, you've got sort of global scope, pandemics, global scope, environment, global scope, but you can kind of see this pullback. So that's why, I think that organizations like the American Council and others are vital for going forward. And it has to be done with small pieces. So, as the types of activities that, for example, that ACG has had where we bring German parliamentarians over, or, German journalists or others, these are all wonderful activities. And I hope from the United States side, what the polls show for Germans taking part in this is that, then the Chicago Council on Global Affairs most recent study kind of shows this too. Americans haven't turned off from the world. I mean, this most recent poll asked, should Americans play an active role in global affairs? 68% to 30%. Should we support NATO? 73%. Consult with major allies? 71%. Is trade good for the economy? 74%. Is it good for relations with neighbors? 85%. Even U.S. jobs? 59%. There's a basis there for public opinion to be organized. Frankly, our leadership has failed on that.
So Bob, let me ask you a closing question, which may merit an entire hour on its own, but it's been interesting to hear you talk about how you have used history to try to frame the questions that you've wanted to ask, but also how you've used diplomacy to look into the future and sort of anticipate what might happen. It seems to me, and I think you might share this, that there have been seismic events that have recalibrated international relations. I think that the fall of the Berlin Wall is one of those. Certainly for Americans, the 9/11 attacks in 2001 was one of those. But I also think that the pandemic belongs to those seismic events that were not anticipated and that have the potential of really changing the world after we emerge from the pandemic. So as you look to sort of the mid to the long term, what do you think some of the lasting effects of this moment in history might be? And what would you encourage people to keep their eye out for as they try to look into the future as well?
So I'm still undecided about the pandemic's long-term effects, in part because with the eye on history, I look at the Spanish influenza, and we're lost much greater number of lives. But the lesson that I draw, or the insight I draw from that, is I think the Spanish influenza was combined with other effects. So there was the disappointment after World War I. There's the sense of destruction, the humankind's ability to tear itself apart, which kind of then did fall into the 20s and the 30s and the breakdowns that we then encountered in the Second World War. So I think I connect the pandemic with partly what's going on in the larger international stage. And it may be parochial of me, but I think if the United States sort of abandons the alliance and economic structure that it created over 70 years, you could have a world that looks much more like the world of 1900 with sort of great power, sort of manipulation and competition. There are clearly going to be, you can see changes through the technology side. What we're already seeing in the nature of this rebound, not still full recovery, is if you're linked to the digital world, people can accommodate. But this means you need to pay special attention to those outside of it. A lot of small and medium-sized enterprises that don't have the same digital connectivity. People in the retail sector, often sort of women. And so part of the challenge for public policy will be, can we help? And one reason I wrote this about developing markets is they maybe get sort of left behind in the process. I think we're going to have a greater alertness to sort of those challenges. Another one that will strike Germans, of course, is we're certainly expanding a lot of debt. Our fiscal policies have sort of really been quite forthcoming. I'm not arguing against that, but I think over time we're going to have to give some thought, not to an austerity policy, but to sort of shrewder and more targeted use of fiscal resources and how you create government incentives for the private sector. So all those issues, including sort of the relations with China and other parties, sort of will be part of the mix in the stew that people will have to navigate. And so that's why I emphasize anticipation as opposed to prediction. You can see these. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a specific outcome. And the bottom line for me, it really comes back to where this story began. For the United States and for Germany and a Germany in Europe, while we're going to have differences, you're most likely to have a commonality of perspectives on this as opposed to others in the world. There'll be other parties, Japan, Australia, Canada, North America, others. But so we're very, very foolish to sort of take those ties for granted. And so for that, I thank for all of you to keep promoting them.
Well, Bob Zoellick, I want to thank you so much for spending this hour with us on behalf of the American Council on Germany, but also the German Consulate and 1014. This has been truly tremendous. It's been thoughtful and thought-provoking and great fun. So thank you again for being with us. I'd also like to thank our viewers for some great questions. And to those of you who are watching now, I hope you'll join us on Monday when we'll be talking with 3 young Bundestag members who are between the ages of 30 and 33 and were infants or toddlers when German unification took place. We'll be talking about contemporary Germany and Germany's place in Europe and in the world. So I hope you can tune in Monday as well. But Bob, a final thanks to you. It's been great to see you, and I look forward to seeing you again soon, hopefully in person.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.